Good afternoon and welcome to the START National Online Training Series on the mental health aspects of intellectual and developmental disabilities. Welcome and thank you to today's presenter, Dave Hingsburger. Dave is the Director of Clinical and Educational Supports for VITA Community Living Services. He has worked in service to people with disabilities for over 40 years. Dave has given lectures at an international level, and he has published over 30 books and nearly 100 papers. His work has been called groundbreaking and innovative. He has been inducted into the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame and won the Inspirational Lifetime Achievement Award given out by the LGBT community in Toronto. Welcome, Dave.
So my name is Dave Hingsburger, and I'm the Director of Clinical and Educational Services for VITA Community Living Services. And I've been asked today to speak on the issue of sexuality and intellectual disability. And I'm going to take an approach where at the very beginning, I want to talk just a little bit about what sexuality does and what it means. And then I'm going to move in and talk more about the concerns that we need to have in working with people with intellectual disabilities, specifically in the area of sexuality. I want to tell you a story. I was asked to do a lecture tour of the province of British Columbia in February, and I was asked to travel around and do a variety of different presentations in a variety of different places. And I ended up in a small town in the interior of BC in the Rockies. And it was a Sunday, and I wanted to go out for breakfast. So we hopped in the car and we went off to a restaurant, and we parked, and I got into my wheelchair and we wheeled in. I was lucky that we just happened to find a restaurant that was wheelchair accessible. So my husband and I went in and we waited and we got a table and we sat down and we were given menus. Then moments later, into the restaurant came a couple with intellectual disability. And it was interesting watching them. And I'm going to let you know a little thing about me. I do watch people when they're out in the community, not specifically people with intellectual disabilities, but people who are around me who somehow gather my interest. And what was interesting about them was not their intellectual disability. What was interesting about them was how they managed as a couple, because they both had mobility issues. They were both ambulatory, but he walked with a walker and she walked with a cane. They were brought over to a table, which was just a couple from us, and they were sat down. And it was interesting to watch the rhythm that they had in their relationship, because he took his walker and folded it up and he leaned it against the table. And the entire time he was doing that, she had her cane hovering in the air, waiting for the walker to come to rest. And as soon as it did, she hooked her cane onto the walker. Now, you know that move had been made 1,000 times before. Well, a few minutes later, into the restaurant came a group of young teenage girls. And they came in and they were waiting to be seated, and they looked over and they saw me in my wheelchair, and they saw these two with their mobility devices and their intellectual disability. Now, the leader of the teenage girls was a very hostile kind of woman, and her face just twisted up when she saw us and our differences. And when the waitress came to seat them, she said very loudly. Now, very loudly means she wasn't speaking to the group, and she wasn't speaking to the waitress. She was speaking to the restaurant. She said, "I'm not sitting in no room." Now, I have to tell you, I was immediately very angry, and I could tell that the couple was also, they were more hurt than angry. But the waitress, who looked like she could bring down a bull, took them and brought them to a part of the restaurant where they were out of our view. And it's interesting, like when something like that happens, when you're different, because somehow for the people in the restaurant, the issue became us. Like, we were there, we brought our difference in there. What did we expect to happen? but I just took a breath and calmed myself down, and I was looking at the menu and talking to Joe, and we were talking about what we were going to have. And I noticed that they had eggs Benedict. Now I love eggs Benedict, and I know that I'm not supposed to have it. My doctor doesn't think it's the best of foods, but I'd been working hard, and it was a Sunday, and it was a working weekend, and I can talk myself into. So we both order our eggs Benedict, and then the waitress comes over and takes the order from the couple at the table that I had described to you. Well, Joe and I chat for a little bit, and then the waitress comes back and brings us our food, and then goes back and gets the food from the table that is next to her. And when she comes, it's very, very different than we had sitting in our little island of privilege here. They didn't have the money that we had. They probably saved for that breakfast. I don't know. But the waitress brought the breakfast over, and she sat it down in front of the man, poured him a coffee, set the toast down in front of him with the rest of the meal, and left. And she had nothing. She had nothing. But then he reached forward and he took her plate and brought it towards him. And he took a knife and he cut between the two eggs and he slid one over onto her plate. And then he took some of the hash browns and pushed them onto her plate. And he took one of the two rashers of bacon and set it on her plate, and took one of the pieces of toast and gave it to her, grabbed her cup and poured her a bit of coffee and set it down. Now, this process took a little bit of time, but I want you to know that everybody in the restaurant was noticing them. And then he reached his hand forward, and she reached her hand forward, and they took each other's hand, and they bowed and said grace over that meal. And I want you to know, in that moment, everybody in the restaurant envied them. Envied them. It didn't matter that they had an intellectual disability. It didn't matter that they lived in poverty. It didn't matter any of those things. What mattered was they had a relationship where they valued one another. They had a relationship where they shared what they had with one another. They had a relationship where they treated each other with gentleness. Now, I don't know about you, but I can get fairly cynical about relationships these days. And to see a couple who truly loves one another and acts out that love, it sort of brings me to the point of envy. And I think the whole restaurant envied them. Relationships. What relationships do, and they do for all of us, they elevate us. They elevate us in how we feel about ourselves, in knowing that we are loving beings who are worth being loved. And it elevates us to the community that sees us, because they see us as loving beings who are worthy of being loved. So these relationships are incredibly valued because they give value. They give value. And I want you to know that people with disabilities know that, because I'll tell you, I worked in the area of sexuality and disability for a very, very long time. And I have counseled, I can't even tell you how many people with disabilities. And I can't even tell you the hundreds, if not thousands of people I have done sex education and abuse prevention training with. And in all of that time, I have never once been asked a question by a person with a disability to which the answer was penis goes into vagina. Never once. The question I get most often is, how do I get a boyfriend? How do I get a girlfriend? How do I know when I'm in love? How do I know when someone loves me? How do I know? All these questions that are about relationships. Now, we've been really good about teaching about sex, the mechanics of sex, which takes very little time. But the mechanics of relationship, that's something much different. It's much different from And sex education does not equal relationship training. And we have to remember that because we somehow boil it all down into some kind of physical act, and we worry about condoms and we worry about safety and we worry about all those things, and we should. But we should also be worried about safety over here too. We should be worried about safety as people talk about relationships and the intense desire they have for relationships. You know, I remember meeting a fellow with an intellectual disability who told me at an abuse prevention training class that he was lonely. This guy was like the poster child for the community living movement. He had his own apartment. He had a job where he got paid real wages for that job. He had what he was supposed to want. He had what we wanted for him as a community living movement. He had all of that. But when I asked him what did he do, what did he do in the evenings and what did he do in the weekends, he told me he just stayed home. And I said, you just stayed home? Now this was a young man. He was a good-looking guy. I mean, he was just sitting at home, all by himself in this apartment, coming back from a job where he worked incredibly hard. So I wanted to know why he sat alone. And I asked him, and he said, "Well, I don't know how to say this, but have you ever had friends who pretended to be friends, but then they weren't, and they ended up taking your stuff, or they ended up hurting you?" And I said, "Yeah, I understand what that is." And he said, "Well, that happens to me all the time, all the time." And I said, "So you're lonely?" He said, "I'm really lonely." And I said, "Have you told your staff?" And he told me that he did tell his staff. He told his staff two things. Number one, he was lonely. And number two, he couldn't figure out the mechanics of trusting in a relationship. He couldn't figure out who to trust and how to trust and when to trust and under what circumstances maybe you should mistrust. He told them all that. And you know what the staff said? "Oh, don't worry, I'm your friend." Like, what did you just say? You know, we have to be very careful. We aren't their friends. We aren't their friends. We use the language of our friendship to somehow avoid looking straight on at the isolation and loneliness of people with disabilities and the life that they lead. Oh, we all as staff like them, so they must have a really rich life because just being with us is such a wonderful thing. No, it's not. We're paid to be there. So people with disabilities are desperate to form these kinds of relationships. Desperate. And I want you to think about that desperation. Because what that desperation does for people with disabilities and people without is it makes them vulnerable. Now, they're already vulnerable because they have an intellectual disability and they're very easy to trick and manipulate. And on top of that, they have this desire, this intense desire to form relationships, to be loved, to be seen as somebody who loves, to be seen as somebody who is worthy of love. This intense desire, this intense desire. But we don't teach about that. We don't talk about that. We're over here with condoms. We're over here with birth control pills. We're over here with whatever about the mechanics of sexuality. So we need to look what happens when you take somebody who is considered to be socially vulnerable and add to that the issue of desperation. And what happens? Well, it's a powder keg. Let's be clear about that. It's a powder keg. And I want to give you some case examples so they have an understanding of what it is that I'm saying. So I want to tell you three different stories that illustrate three different points. The first is I had a guy who desperately wanted to go to a gay bathhouse. Now he happened to be gay, and he wanted to go to a gay bathhouse. And for those of you who don't know what a gay bathhouse is, what? A gay bathhouse is where gay men go to have sex. It is not a den of prostitution because money doesn't exchange hands. Lots of things exchange, but it's certainly not money. Now, he really wanted to go there, and he had surprised us with the request. Personally, I don't think any of us knew he had even heard of these things, okay? But secondly, he caught us because the agency that I was consulting to had a very strong belief, and they believed that people with disabilities had a right to go in the community to wherever non-disabled people went. Now, if you're going to have that belief, you need to stop and think for a second of all the people, all the places the non-disabled people go. So non-disabled people go to bathhouses, and they didn't want him to, and they discouraged him to. But they sat down and they began to teach him. And what were they worried about? They were worried about HIV. They were worried about HIV prevention. They were worried about condom use. They were worried about that kind of thing. And they're right to be worried about that. They never for a second thought about the mechanics of relationship. They never for a second thought about what are some homosocial skills that he might need to know to be in that kind of environment. So they did the training. I helped them design that training. They double checked their training by sending him to the AIDS Committee of Toronto, where they had people who did counseling and so forth, with the question, given the fact that this man has an intellectual disability, does he have the information and does he understand the information enough to keep himself safe? And when he was tested or talked to by them down there, I don't know what their process was. They said, yeah, he knows everything that somebody needs to know about the prevention of disease. So we got them to send a letter just to cover our butts. You know, sometimes that's what paper is really for. So the decision was made that he could go. So he went down, and he'd been going down for a period of 5 or 6 weeks, and then they did a random test on him, and it was discovered that he was now, which he wasn't before, HIV positive. Now, people were really upset. I mean, they were really upset about this. Okay, so they bring him in, and they sit him down, and they talk to him. You know, they wanted to know what happened. Well, when they discovered what happened, it wasn't what they were suspecting. This guy went down, and the very first time he went down there, he met his boyfriend. And he only had sex with his boyfriend. He didn't have sex with multiple partners, which is what typically happens in those places. But he didn't. He had sex with one man, and that was his boyfriend. Now, even though we called this man his boyfriend, they never went out for dinner together. They never went to a movie. They never did anything outside what was happening in the bathhouse. Now, I think he was probably being exploited, but my point of view here doesn't matter. What matters is his point of view, and this was his boyfriend, and this was a relationship. And let's be honest, it's the first one he's ever had. So when they asked him about his boyfriend and having sex with his boyfriend, they said, well, did you remember to use the condom? And he actually laughed. And he said, no, we didn't use the condom. They said, what did you use? He said, my boyfriend said There are spray-on condoms. Spray-on condoms? Well, it was discovered that this man was using vegetable spray and spraying it on himself as a lubricant and calling it a spray-on condom and infected him with HIV. Now, if that surprises you, that surprises me. Because shouldn't we have anticipated that this man going into that environment, not because it's a gay environment, because it's simply an environment he's going into looking for a partner. And the desire that he has to be in relationship is going to make it very difficult for him to see when he's being used. And it's going to make it very difficult for him to question the information that he's been given because his desire for relationship is stronger than the skills that he was given about condom and about safety. The desire was so much stronger. So that's one. So the information that he had was so good about disease transmission, but we had forgotten that the desire for relationship could take that all away, like a big eraser in his mind, taking that information away because he wants this so very badly, that he is not going to be a critical thinker at all. He's not going to apply his information. The second fellow I wanted to tell you about is a guy who he worked. Well, let me tell you how I first met him because that brings it into a context. This is a guy who, when I was working in the sexuality clinic, we got a call from the school about. Now, the school had a sex education curriculum, but he wasn't in that curriculum. He didn't take that curriculum. His disability exempted him from that curriculum. And a lot of people get upset with this kind of thing, but I have to tell you, many of the curriculums that are made for non-disabled people move way too fast. And I'm not worried that this kid would be in high school and be in a geography class and pick up some stuff and miss other stuff about geography. But I really worry that he'd be in a sex education class and pick up some and miss others. So nonetheless, we were called in because we do sex education. So we sat down and we met this guy. He was a young guy. I think he was 16 years old and really responsible. We talk about responsibility. He knew there were diseases out there. He knew that there was tragedies that happened in the area of sexuality. And he wanted to avoid all of it. He wanted to have sex, but he wanted to do it responsibly. Like, what 16-year-old kid does that? But nonetheless, for him, that was a very big deal. He wanted to be responsible, and to a certain degree, rather poetically, he wanted to show his love through the care that he took of his partner. Man. So anyways, he's 16. The parents get called about us doing sex education for their son. And I want you to know the parents went just, every single word that I'm thinking about in my head is combined with a swear word. Like it just, so I'm sorry, I have to do it. They were really, really, really upset. And they were very clear. No way was there somebody going to come into their child's life and raise the issue of sexuality with their child. They thought somehow that because he was a disability, he was going to be exempted from all this and that they weren't going to have to worry about it. So I bring somebody in who's going to raise the issue. They didn't even seem to understand that I didn't just show up magically going, let's talk sex. He had requested it. But no, they got angry at me. They got angry at my agency. Letters went, and But I'm used to people being angry at me over the area of sexuality. It's happening less now than it did then, but nonetheless, he doesn't get the training. That's what's important. So when he's 18, he's still in school because he can be in school until he's 21. He begins doing a work placement in the community in a small factory. And he goes there and he works and he does a really good job. I'm talking a really good job. So when his work placement is over, the management comes forward and says, you know what, we'll hire him. He's really good. He always shows up. He's always on time. He's got a good spirit about him. He's able to manage the workplace, which what they meant was they tease him all the time and call him the R word all the time, and he manages to handle that okay. So meeting happens with the school and with the parents and with him, and he's really excited because this is a real job, and they're offering him a real salary. So he quits school and he goes to work. Now, while he's at work, he manages. Like he manages the environment pretty well. I mean, it does get him down that they call him the R word all the time, and they make fun of him, and they do things to set him up and all that. But he manages all that, and he seems to take it in relatively good humor. Well, one day, the machines at the factory broke down. They just broke down, and there was no work to do. So the guys all gathered at these big picnic tables, which were spread in the building, and they all sat there and waited while the mechanics came in to fix the machine. And while that was going on, they were laughing and joking and so forth. Now, what do you think these guys were laughing and joking about? They were laughing and joking about sex. Now, he's there, and he's finding it all very funny. He's enjoying it. He's really enjoying it. And there they are laughing about something that's not him. So he makes the mistake at that moment of thinking that he's accepted. He's accepted. That was a mistake. So they continue to laugh and joke, and he starts to joke too. And when he jokes, he lets it slip that he's a virgin. That was a mistake. That was a mistake. They are on him again. He's an R word virgin, and you know, he coped with the R word because he was doing a job, and he was proving them wrong every single day. But the virgin thing, this was an attack on his masculinity. This was an attack on his ability to be in a relationship and be loved and be seen as worthy of. It was an attack on all of that. And you remember 2 years prior, he had said, I want to learn this stuff. So, anyways, what is he going to do? What is he going to do? He can't go to his parents. He already knows that this kind of stuff really upsets them. I mean, he already knows that. So there's a fellow at the factory that he's closer to than some of the others because the two of them have a shared interest, and that shared interest is wrestling. I don't get it. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't watch it. But nonetheless, the two of them did. And they used to talk about wrestling. Well, when he approaches this guy to talk to him, because he's closer to him than other people, and he sees him as a real man, he sits down and he wants to know, not, tell me about sex. He says, how do I get a relationship? How do I get a relationship? So this fellow sees an opportunity. Now, there was a wrestler at the time who I think his name was Ravishing Rick Rude. I've never even looked him up. I probably should. But I think the name is very funny and I remember it. Ravishing Rick Rude. Well, apparently what Ravishing did, or Rick did, I'm not sure how to address him, what he did, at the end of a match where he won, apparently he would grab his trunks and pull them down and moon the audience, and the women in the audience would just be in a frenzy. Now, there's a guy to model off of. So this fellow said, you have to understand something that Rick knows, and that is women love men's. So what you got to do is you got to flash some. Now you can guess what happens next. He doesn't take the information and think about it critically. He doesn't think that I'm a member of a population of people that other people trick and manipulate, and that may be happening here. He doesn't think that. He thinks, that's what I'm going to do. And why is he doing that? Because this drive for relationship, this drive for sexuality makes him uncritical. So he gets up on a Saturday morning very early, which surprises his parents, because when they get up, he's gone. Well, he's grabbed his bike and he's gone a few blocks over where there's a young woman who's a single mom who has a small child of 4 or 5 years old. So he stands outside of her house for a very long time, thinking about her. Because you see, she's beautiful. She's a beautiful woman. But he stands there for a very, very long time, which is already breaking a law. So when she comes out of the house in the morning to do something, he drops his bike, which is what gets her attention. He turns himself around and he grabs his pants and he bends over and drops them down. Now, she screams, not in the way that fans scream at a match. She screams because she's frightened, really frightened. And that scream, and he could hear the terror in her voice, that surprised him. So he stood up without pulling his pants up and turns around to speak to her. Now he's exposing his genitals to her. While that's happening, her young child, hearing the commotion outside, walks outside and also sees him standing there naked. Police are called, he's arrested, and I want you to know it went to court. I want you to know that testimony was given, and I want you to know he went to jail. And when he came out of jail, he came out a registered sex offender. Now, you're going to start a lot of stuff here. You're going to start saying, that's not fair. There are mitigating circumstances. That's not fair. Well, let's stop for a second and realize something. Firstly, this man had victims. He had victims. This woman was terrified, just terrified by his behavior. Okay, the child was forced to see something that was really inappropriate for them to see at that stage of their development. So he has victims. And one of the things that the judge said is if you people say they're ready to be in their community, they damn well better be ready to be in the community. And that may seem harsh, but it's also kind of true. You know, we want community living for people. So therefore, we need to prepare them for community living. So what's being left out? What's being left out is that we're not taking into consideration the disability when we speak about sexuality, disability, and relationships. We're just not thinking about it, and we need to. Now, I've written about, and in my own practice, I use something called disability-informed therapy, which means you have to think about disability when you're thinking about providing service. There are so many people say, "Oh, don't think about the ability. I see ability. I don't see disability." Oh, shut up. The person has a disability. It's nothing to be ashamed of, and it's nothing to be ignored. Oh, I don't see your wheels. Well, I don't understand why you can't. They're right freaking under me. So we need to understand that disability means something. Disability matters, and it matters socially, and it matters politically, and it matters in all sorts of different ways, but it also matters clinically. So what we need to realize is that people with disabilities are really easily tricked and manipulated. They're really easily tricked and manipulated. And when it comes to sexuality and when it comes to desire for a relationship, that's made much easier. It's just made much easier. And if you take a look at the sexuality curriculums that are out there, and there are many, and they're very good. They're very good. But most of them, I haven't looked recently, but most of them don't mention disability in any real way. Now they're a little bit more inclusive in that they have pictures of disabled people too, and that didn't used to be. But actually speaking about the state of having a disability and what that means, most of them don't even come close to talking about that. So at my home agency, when I began there, we started doing sex education for people with disabilities, and I had two people who have since left, Michelle and John, who were trained to do sex education with people with disabilities. So I had them put together a curriculum that took three different curriculums using three different approaches and three different types of material together to create one package, okay? And they would teach that. But one of the classes was going to be about disability. It was going to be about disability, and it was going to talk about some of the ways that people are tricked and manipulated. So they were very nervous. And it was so weird. They were really nervous about teaching disabled people about being disabled, which is really kind of weird if you think about it. Like I can't imagine doing a class for women and never mentioning once that they were women, But anyways, so the very first time they were going to teach it, I was talking to them. They were getting more and more nervous about it and reviewing what it was that they were going to do. And they were very anxious. So I had become quite anxious by the time we got to that point. And I said, I want you guys to call me immediately after the class. So they did call me. And the interesting thing was that I don't know what they thought was going to happen. They called the class dropping the ball. But that's not what happened at all, or even close to it. What happened was people with disabilities already knew. They already knew. Firstly, they already knew they were disabled. But secondly, socially, they already knew that people tricked and manipulated them. It had happened with their money. It had happened with all sorts of different things. So it had happened a lot. And because it had happened a lot, they just thought it was a natural state of being. They didn't think that maybe, potentially, there were solutions, there were ideas. So the class went from the acknowledgement of this as an issue to strategy, things you could think about, how to slow yourself down, how to trust, how to buy yourself time. All of these skills that people can use in these kinds of circumstances. And it was really successful. Now, that doesn't mean that people walked out and they were automatically and without question completely safe, because skills are skills that need to be practiced. Skills are skilled and they need to be used over time. So this was the beginning of the development of those skills, the development of the understanding of the power of your own voice and the boundaries around your body and who controls space and who controls the space around you and who controls this. You understand? That's the kind of thing that we began teaching, because that people with disabilities had a right to know that information. People with disabilities had a right to learn that information, and they had a right to expect that their trainers would give them that information. But typically that doesn't happen. Typically that doesn't happen at all. So there was no bomb to be dropped. This was information that was needed. This was information that was wanted. And it was information that to a certain extent could protect people. Because there was another way that their desire for relationships ended up hurting them. I've given you a couple of examples. I want to give you one more. I did consulting in New York City for a couple of different organizations, and I would go down on a regular basis, and mostly what I did was consultation, and most of it was sitting around tables or reviewing policies or writing policies and doing that kind of thing. Occasionally, I would teach a class, or occasionally I would meet with the trainers and the workers in the area of sexuality. And less often than that, I would meet people with disabilities themselves. Well, when I arrived on this particular day, I went in and people were frantic. They were really pleased that I was there. I had gotten there early, which is my habit. And they had told me they had canceled my entire day. So everything I had been told to prepare for wasn't happening that day. They wanted to take me out, and they wanted me to meet somebody with a disability. And it was a fair drive, but they had decided, and they told me that they kind of had to take me there because this fellow wasn't leaving his apartment, and they simply couldn't get him out. So we get to this fellow's apartment, and I go and I sit down with a man who's destroyed. He's just destroyed. He's distraught. You could see tears had been all over his face, and that he was simply having a really, really, really difficult time. So when I finally got him to tell the story, and he told it, and he would pause, and he would have to stop and cry and so forth. This took a very long time. But I'm going to tell you the story. So he got his own apartment, and he got a job, and he had a worker that came in and provided him support, and he was doing pretty much everything that he wanted to be doing, and when they sat down with him, they said, you kind of achieved all of the big goals that you had set for yourself. Is there anything you still want to work on? And he said, yes. And they said, what? He said, I want to learn to do my own banking. I want to control my own money. And they were a little hesitant on that. They were worried about it. But nonetheless, they said, sure. So they began in the way that we begin They began by having somebody go with him and help him fill out the forms that he needed, or help him write a check, or any of those sorts of things. And they would go with him right to the wicket where they would meet with the person who's there, and make sure that the process went properly, and make sure that they were giving all his money and so forth. So he was doing better and better and better and better and better. And let me tell you, everybody in the bank knew him. Okay? They all knew his name. They knew the worker's name. He would go in, and it was like that scene from Cheers where everybody called it Norm, and it was very similar to that. It seemed like a very friendly place. And when he went in, his name was called, his work was called, and they all said, hey. Now, he's going to go in for the very first time. He's going to go in by himself. Now, one of the mistakes that we make is that when we go out with people with disabilities in a variety of different circumstances, we make ourselves so visible. We make ourselves so incredibly visible. The best support is as invisible as possible. Because you see, when we're there and it's noticeable that we're there and we're there all the time, it becomes really obvious when we're not. Really obvious. So he's there by himself for the very first time, and he's a little bit nervous. Now, there was one of the clerks who had taken a shine to him, and he would, as much as possible, go to her wicket because he trusted her. He liked her, and things went well, and she was willing to spend the extra time to help him if he needed help. So he wants to be successful. He gets in the lineup, and he comes to the front of the line, but she's busy at another wicket, so he lets people go by him until her wicket is free. So when her wicket's free, he goes up to her and does his banking. And when the banking's done, he starts to leave, and one of the other clerks calls him over. And they said, did you ask her out? And he said, no, I didn't ask her out. Why not? Why didn't you ask her out? She's really pretty. She really likes you. She's hoping that you're going to ask her out. And he didn't believe it. He didn't believe it. So he kept going back to the bank, and he was called over and over again. Why aren't you asking her out? Why are you asking her out? I mean, are you gay? What's wrong with you? You know, she's very pretty. You know, she's going to end up with somebody else just because you didn't have the nerve to speak up, and pressured him and pressured him and pressured him. Now, at first, he didn't believe. That's not to say he didn't want to. But at first, he didn't. So one day he gets up in the morning, he's going to go do his banking, and he decides he's going to ask her out. She's very pretty. She's kind to him. He likes her. He gets himself all dressed up. He scrubs up good. And he goes down to the bank, and he's got his banking papers done, and he gets in the line, and this time he goes straight to her wicket. Okay? So she's doing the banking with him and so forth, and she looks up and says, you look good today. You know, anything special happening? And he got a shy sort of smile, and he said, yeah, I'm going to ask somebody out on a date. Good for you, she said. So he leans forward and he says, could I take you out for coffee? And suddenly she realizes that she's being asked out on a date. And she bursts out laughing. She just bursts out laughing and says, no, don't ask me. Ask, and points at somebody else in the bank. And everybody starts to laugh. And at that point, he realized he'd been made a fool. He'd been made a fool in this place that he thought was safe, that he thought welcomed him, that he thought liked him. This woman who had been kind to him, her laughter now was cruel. And he left and he was devastated, just devastated. So he went back to his apartment and he says, "That's it. I'm done. I'm not putting myself through that again. I'm not going through that again. You guys can't make it." So we had a talk, him and I, and it was a fairly blunt talk. Because you see, I've been fat my whole life. Okay, I haven't been disabled my whole life. I've only been disabled for about I think it's 16 years now. But nonetheless, I wasn't in the wheelchair then. But I've always been fat, and because of my weight, I've never been seen as somebody who's worthy of relationship. People are always surprised to meet my husband, and always surprised, really surprised that he's really handsome. And it's like, what on earth could Joe ever see a day? And the early part of our relationship, people actively tried to break us up because they wanted to get Joe out of my clutches. So I kind of understand what it's like to be somebody who was thought unworthy. So we had a heart-to-heart talk about what that means. And we had a heart-to-heart talk about what that pain was, because I wasn't going to deny it. I wasn't going to say that what happened needed to be looked at it in a different light. It didn't. It didn't. We had to acknowledge cruelty. We had to acknowledge that he'd been set up. We had to acknowledge that people purposely hurt us sometimes. We had to acknowledge those. So what we had to do with him was, firstly, we had to help him deal with the trauma that caused. And it was trauma, and it was serious trauma. And there could be no thought of moving forward with anything more than his job or apartment until that trauma was dealt. I'm pleased to say he's doing much better now, and he's got a girlfriend, and they're happy and so forth. He doesn't bank at that bank anymore, and he shamed them when he left. But that's another story for another time. So here's what we're talking about. People with disabilities have the same drive for relationship that non-disabled people do. The same drive for relationship, the same need, and for the same reason. However, their disability makes them vulnerable. It makes them vulnerable in kind of an educational kind of way. We have to make sure that the training that they get is appropriate training given to them at their level in their style of learning. We need to understand what the style of learning is that they have, and we need to teach it, and we need to be sure that they have the information upon which they can make good decisions about your body. But being able to make good decisions about your body does not make you able to have good decisions about your heart and about the relationships that you have. So people with disabilities need other training. They need training on how to be disabled in the world to a certain extent, but certainly within the context of the relationships that they have. And I would argue both friendship relationships and love relationships. Because in both of those areas, people with disabilities are incredibly vulnerable. And they're made vulnerable not because they have an intellectual disability, but because the need for those things is so strong. And the desire that they have is so strong to have friends and to have people who love them that it makes anybody vulnerable. Anybody vulnerable. I am sure there are people who are watching this who do not have an intellectual disability, who've gone through a period of time where they were so desperate for friends or so desperate for relationships, they made very bad decisions. Even though they've got the right information, they still make bad decisions. And those bad decisions are made for reasons other than a sexual need. It's kind of an emotional need, a need to be nurtured and a need to be loved and a need to be in relationship. So we have a responsibility then as people who work with people with disabilities to make sure we think about their disability when we do the training. Now, this can be very difficult because we come at this from, forgive me, ableist privilege. I think most of the people that I know, when they talk about disability, don't want to talk about disability at all. They want to pretend somehow that disability doesn't exist and that disability doesn't matter. I'm telling you, yes, it exists, and yes, it matters. And matters in a whole pile of different ways. So when we do our training here, we need to stop and say, how does this person's life as a disabled person make them vulnerable? Yeah, they're vulnerable because they don't have the appropriate information that's been denied to them for years, but it also makes them vulnerable because they live in an emotional desert where they're not getting water. There's a desperate need for relationship, a desperate need for love, a desperate need to be proven as worthy. And that's what relationships do. And I'm not questioning that drive or that need for worthiness. I'm questioning whether or not we've thought about it in doing our training. Have we given solutions? Have we helped people see their world? Have we talked to people with disabilities about what they can expect and what they need to watch for? There are all sorts of red flags. So in our training with people with disabilities about this, we want to make sure that they leave knowing that we know. Knowing that we know. I met a woman with a disability who wouldn't talk to her father about what was going on in her relationships and what was going on in her life, because to do so, she would have to tell her father that she had Down syndrome. Because her parents never mentioned it and they never spoke about it. Because disability has been an unspeakable thing. So we're an unspeakable minority. People use all sorts of different language to hide who we are. But we're disabled, that's our life, and that's our experience. So I ask of you, when you're doing work with people with disabilities, not just in this area, you have to think about disability when you're doing training. You have to think about disability when you're doing inclusion work and all of those sorts of things. There's all sorts of different ways. You have to think about disability when you think about people who are in touch with the law. So what does it mean? And why are people with disabilities overrepresented in the criminal population? There are reasons for that. There are reasons for that. And disability plays its role. It's an important thing. So you work with disabled people, be proud that you work with disabled people, and let that pride shine on the lives that they lead. Thank you very much for having me. I hope this gave you some information and certainly things to think about. And I understand that we're going to talk in a couple of hours live, and I look forward to that. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you for viewing today's session, and thank you to today's presenter, Dave Hingsburg. Please share your feedback by completing the training evaluation you were sent about this presentation.